Hi everyone, and welcome to the Imagining a New We video blog with me, Dr. Samantha Cutrara, a video series designed to help history teachers and other history educators teach history in ways that are more meaningful, transformative, and inclusive for their students. You can't see this because you can only see from here up, but I am wearing a party dress today. And you know why I'm wearing a party dress today? Because we are having a little historian party today. I am so excited because I have not one, not two, not three, but 4 historians that are going to be speaking today on today's video on the history of women's suffrage in Canada. Between 2018 and now into the future, UBC has done this series of academic history books on the history of women's suffrage in the different provinces as well as Indigenous women. It is an amazing series. Here are all the covers. And there are 7 different authors, and we have 4 of them today. 4 of them to talk with us about the history of women's suffrage in Canada. Now, I am so excited about this, obviously, dress and all, that I'm doing not 1 but 2 videos, 2 shorter videos. So the first video is going to focus on things that they learned, so ways to kind of challenge or complicate the women's suffrage narrative that we often teach in our classrooms. And the second video is going to be about some of the primary sources that they use so that you too might be able to bring them into your classrooms. You can watch the videos individually or you can watch them together. Either way, it's going to be amazing because of the all-star, I want to say all-star cast, but sure, I'm just going to say, no, panel. The all-star panel / cast that we get to talk to today. So we get to talk to Dr. Joan Sangster from Trent University, Dr. Heidi MacDonald from the University of New Brunswick, Dr. Lara Campbell from Simon Fraser University, Dr. Tarah Brookfield from Laurier Brantford campus. And if you remember, I mentioned her book that's already on my bookshelf because Tarah and I are friends, and so I got to so I read her book early. So let's go over to Zoom. Let's see this fantastic panel of speakers and learn the complications of this history, or to learn how to complicate this history in ways that we might not be doing right now in our classrooms because we don't have the evidence for that. So let's go over to Zoom. Hello, thank you all for joining me today. I am so excited to have all 4 of you here, 4 of the 7 authors from this series of 7. Thank you so much. I was saying in my little introduction, I'm wearing a little party dress because I'm very excited to be in such company. Before we get started, can we do some introductions?
I'm Joan Sangster, and I'm a Canadian historian specializing in labor and women's history. I recently taught in gender and women's studies at Trent University, and my contribution to the suffrage series was a book, 100 Years of Struggle, The History of Women in the Vote in Canada.
My name is Lara Campbell, and I'm a professor in the Department of Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies at Simon Fraser University. And I'm a Canadian historian of women's and gender history. And my contribution to this series is A Great Revolutionary Wave, A History of Women in the Vote in British Columbia.
I'm Tarah Brookfield. I'm a professor at Wilfrid Laurier University, and I teach in the history program in youth and children's studies. And I'm the author of Our Voices Must Be Heard, which is all backwards right now, but is the volume on Ontario for the suffrage series.
And I'm Heidi MacDonald. I'm a professor at the University of New Brunswick in St. John. And my book in this series is called We Shall Persist: Women in the Vote in Atlantic Canada.
You know, I really appreciate what you were saying about the newspapers and how that highlighted elements of the research that you weren't expecting. And you know, primary sources are obviously a key element of historians' work. And in so many classrooms right now, there is a much greater emphasis on students using primary sources, which is a really exciting way to see a more variety or more very diverse history. It can also, though, just reaffirm the histories we already know. So are there primary sources that you would like to highlight that really illuminated particular things for you, or that you found like surprising or exciting that maybe teachers would be able to utilize in their classrooms, teachers or professors and instructors, of course, as well?
I might talk just for a second about photographs, because I think they're a source of frustration and a source of joy, both of those things. And I think we don't have that many photographs of suffragists and of the early suffrage movement in particular, compared to British and American historians. And that seems like something of a lack. So if I came upon a photo, I'd be so excited that I could actually get something in the book. So there was a couple, one in particular that I was very excited to find, and it was actually a photo from 1936 of 4 Japanese Canadians standing on the steps of the Canadian Parliament, one of whom is a woman, Heidi MacDonald, and they had all just made a presentation to a parliamentary committee about why Japanese Canadians should be allowed to vote. And of course, they heard them out politely, the parliamentarians, and then they refused to give them the vote. But it's a wonderful photograph of these 4 people looking directly into the camera. And I think it's a great reminder of what we've been talking about, which is that suffrage doesn't end when white women get the vote in 1918. It just goes on and on. The struggle goes on, and it involves men and women, people from different ethnic and racial groups. So finding a photo is always an excitement. And the other photo I was happy to find was one of a group of Toronto women going to a demonstration in Washington in 1913. And there's very few pictures of Canadian suffragists in demonstrations. And this one, though, is very interesting because in 1913, the American suffragists had a very big parade. It was to coincide with the inauguration of Woodrow Wilson. And a group of Canadians went down from Toronto. They were women who probably disagreed on a lot, and during the war they really disagreed on a lot in the next years. But they decided to go together for this demonstration. And it's a reminder of 2 things for me. One is that this was a transnational movement, that people were inspired by what went on in the US or the Britain or Australia, New Zealand, and that they really identified with this international sisterhood. But when the Canadians went, they draped themselves in Union Jacks. So they still had this conception of themselves as very British as well as Canadian. So I think, unfortunately, we don't have enough pictures. So when you find one, you're really, really quite happy. You can get it in, even if it's not a very good, reproduction.
And one of the things I thought of too, linked to the first part, like the first question that we were talking about thinking that suffrage is only one moment, because if you think it is only, in the first couple decades of the 20th century, then you miss looking for a photograph from 1936 or from the 1930s that demonstrate that longer history. So yeah, that's great. Thank you.
I can certainly pick up on what Joan is saying about the lack of photographs as a frustration and a joy. I was surprised by how many suffrage women had not had their photograph taken, or if they had it taken, it no longer exists. And some of the most prominent or well-known women of the time, I actually have no photograph of them at all. I even went to the graveyard in North Vancouver to at least find the headstone of Florence Hall, who was a very well-known social gospel suffragist, and I know where she's buried and I know the section of the graveyard, but there is no headstone. We don't know if it was taken away or if it never existed. So all I have is a photo of the tree under under which she's buried. So when I found one photograph of a parade float in 1913 in Victoria, it's the only image that I have in all of British Columbia of a protest or a parade in which suffragists participated, and it's from the summer of 1913, and it's the Political Equality League in Victoria, and it's a wonderful photo because it encompasses all of these kind of stock images of suffrage in this one float. You see a group of women at the front on horseback with bugles. One of the women in that front group is probably the daughter of Maria Grant, who was about 14 years old on a horse. And the horses are pulling a float. Beside the float are the sons of the leading suffragists of Victoria, and they're decked out in white pantsuits with purple, green, and white sashes, which were the colors of the militant suffragette movement in Great Britain. I only know that because there's a description of the photo somewhere else. The photo itself is in black and white. And then on top of the float are 7 women in white robes with crowns of laurel on their head to represent victory. And in front of them is the name of the country or the state which had most recently allowed women to vote, sort of representing citizenship. And one of those countries was a province in China, which had recently allowed women to vote at the essentially the provincial level. So it was a really interesting float, and it's the only photograph I have in all of British Columbia of something like that. So it was really exciting to find it. That's the photograph there that you can see, and you can see the young men there on the left. Unfortunately, you can't see the women very well on the float. I do believe that young woman right in the front on that white horse with the silver bugle, I'm pretty sure that's Frances Willard Grant, who was the youngest daughter of Maria Grant, who was a leading Methodist suffragist in Victoria, and she named her daughter Frances Willard after the WCTU leader in the United States, because she was a personal heroine for Maria Grant. But I'm pretty sure that's who that is. It's not labeled, and what's interesting is that this photograph in the archives is simply labeled Parade 1913, and I spent many hours believing there had to be a picture of this parade float somewhere in the archives, and so I went through every single photograph in 1913 that was labeled Parade, and I eventually found it. But if you were just using a database, you really had to go through picture by picture in order to find it. So there may be more out there and we just can't find them.
Yeah, thank you for your very evocative description before we got to see it. You know, I used to work for an archives developing their education and exhibition program, and when I worked with teachers, they kind of expected things to be already kind of done, and of course we all know that's not how archives work. And one of the suggestions that I've given teachers is just to like browse archives, especially digital archives, rather than use keyword searches, because you never know what you're going to come up with. And I talk about this photograph of a women's hockey team, but it's labeled girls hockey. And so of course you'd never find it if you were typing in women. And to me, that really, it's demonstrative of how so many elements of women's history can be lost because they weren't labeled correctly. So thank you so much for bringing up that particular primary source. Thank you.
I'm going to say that petitions, although they're very traditional as far as women's suffrage goes, and when we're doing any kind of suffrage research, petitions come up constantly. But seeing a petition is pretty fun. And the sheer volume of names is, I found it really effective, and I picture that it would be effective in a classroom. And there are many available online. the Nova Scotia Archives has a really good set of women's suffrage petitions. And in fact, if you search women's suffrage or women in the vote Nova Scotia Archives, you'll come to a page that has a petition that's just scrolling down all the time, which how many names are on it. And they're basic on the one hand, but on the other, to see the woman's name or the man's name, because both men and women signed, of course, and their address and their occupation. Because the petitions I've seen have those 3 columns. I don't know if there are variations. And it's fun to see how women identified their occupation. It was common to say under occupation, married. And, you know, for anyone who's married, you do recognize it's a lot of work. Some also had housewife or some occupations you wouldn't expect. Here's another thing I'd add to petitions. I wonder if a teacher would find it interesting and then go to Ancestry.com and see who the person was. That's so easy to do now. And Lara in our group put me on to Ancestry.com to find out. She put me onto that to as a quick check to see what a woman's class is, because so I'm giving Lara credit. I think it's brilliant, because if the person has a live-in maid, that's pretty clear what kind of class they are. But anyway, I could see using a petition and Ancestry.com together, and that would, I don't know, be a pretty good 30-minute or hour lesson, I think.
Well, what's really great about petitions is that we still use petitions. So it can do a couple things, because it can also highlight the continuity of activism. It can give students something familiar as a petition that they might want to start, as well as learning about these lists of names. And also Ancestry, I know, is has free trials, but also through the Toronto Public Library, for example, you can get access to that. So that's a very inexpensive way. I also just want to highlight that I think it's great that you all are giving credit back and forth, because I think that is such a key element of historical research, that element of collaboration. So just wanted to highlight that too.
I think we all learned a lot from talking to each other throughout this process. And we could check in with each other about what we were finding to see if other people were finding something similar or something different. And then I think that allowed us all to kind of understand what was unique about the particular women we were researching or the region that we were researching. Usually you work so independently and alone a lot of the time. It was really lovely to be part of something larger than that.
Can I share my primary source too?
Yeah.
Sure. So it's going to repeat a little bit about Heidi's, because I'm going to give a call out to Ancestry.com too, which saved me a lot. But first I'll backtrack just a little bit to say I'm going to recommend parliamentary debates, which are digitized and searchable in many cases, sometimes with a subscription in the library to early Canadiana, I believe, but also printed in most newspapers at the time. And as Heidi had mentioned earlier in part 1 about how many debates she found in the 1880s, in Ontario was very similar. There was almost 1 or 2 debates per year, many of the cases. So you could dip into that and see some of the famous people in Canadian history, the premiers and leaders of the opposition, talk about why they're pro or anti-suffrage. So that's interesting. But there's one debate that really got me excited, and it was in 1844, and it was a discussion of a contested election in Canada West. And in that particular election, the person who lost, the Reform candidate, he was upset because he only lost by 11 votes. So he asked the parliamentary to investigate fraud at the election, and he said one of the reasons he thinks there's fraud is because 7 women voted. And this was a time when there was no gender restrictions on voting. You had to come in. You just had to own property, have different age, and I guess be a British subject and whatnot. So who are these 7 women? Why did they vote? And that just led me down a whole line. And in the parliamentary records, they name the 7 women, but don't give any other information other than say that they're from this particular county at the time. And so then I went through Ancestry, and some of them had very common names like Sarah Williams, and I wasn't able to definitely say that this was this Sarah Williams, but I confidently identified 3 of them and was excited to find one of them was Laura Secord's daughter, which led me through sort of, was she inspired to vote because of her mother and her actions, and it just took me down these paths. So I really encourage both the combination of Ancestry to look up the women who are in all the documents with only a name, but also the parliamentary records as a great source for getting into the ideology at the time. In that particular contested election, they decided that the charges were maybe accurate, that maybe fraud had occurred, but then all the evidence went mysteriously lost, and they said they would let the election stand as is, which I think was just a party were the Grits, and they weren't interested in this contested election from the opposition candidate.
And you said that was 1844.
Yes.
Yeah. So I mean, that's pretty cool too, that it's demonstrative of this earlier history that we were talking about earlier. Are there any other elements that you wanted to bring to the conversation before we close? This has been so great. This has been so amazing.
You're thinking about teaching, one other thing to go look for are cartoons. There are a lot of great cartoons, not very many pictures, but at least there's great cartoons in magazines and newspapers. And you get a sense, particularly of anti-suffrage feeling and the way in which women were portrayed who were suffragists. Lara's already referred to this, the way men were portrayed. I mean, men who supported suffrage were usually henpecked, and women were big, overbearing. They were usually supposed to be ugly. They usually wore glasses like we all do. So I think cartoons are really good.
We're some very attractive suffrage glasses wearing women, so. I think a lot of teachers do use editorial cartoons, but I'm thinking, so I do a series called Pandemic Pedagogy, where I've been talking to people about their ideas about history and teaching history during and after the pandemic. And we can certainly talk about that in another video if you're interested. But I think about an interview I did with Dr. Marie-Hélène Brunet, who is a social studies teacher educator at the University of Ottawa. And she was talking about the icon of the guardian angel right now in Francophone Canada. And she was saying that we really need to deconstruct the gendered elements of these particular icons and signs that we're using to mark this time. And Joan, when you're talking about these editorial cartoons, I think that it's also a really good opportunity to do this kind of deconstruction of these gendered symbols in these, where does that henpecked come from? Why do women wearing glasses, why does that translate to ugly? Why is that a problem that a woman is being labeled as ugly? First I suggest viewers go watch that as a way to think about that, but that's so useful to this conversation, so thank you.
That image too of the henpecked suffragist that you see that all of us have mentioned in some way or the other in the images we've seen, it also then gets picked up in the way that women are written about at the time too. So what I found was a lot of coverage in the newspapers of, say, a suffrage meeting or a debate. The journalist might call them squawking. They might call them like hens in a barnyard. So that image of a barnyard animal talking in a high-pitched voice that's kind of loud really bothered a lot of journalists and bothered a lot of anti-suffrage men, because it seemed to suggest that these were not feminine women in the language and understanding of the time. So that trope really carries, I think, through the 19th and into the 20th century. And it's interesting to see it in both pictures, but also in words too.
Well, and that is a great thing for especially like high school age kids to think about how those things are still being used, right? Like I had somebody say like there were no chicks in history to me the other day, and I was like, first, you're talking to the wrong person. Second, people use the word chicks anymore to refer to women, I guess, in some circles. And like that continuity of the tropes too, I think is a really powerful element of why we should be exploring these histories, why we should be exploring their complexities, and also to recognize the ways that masculinity and femininity are defined and built into these histories and into the present. Yeah. Well, that seems like a really powerful way to end. So thank you all so much for agreeing to do this. This was really fantastic. I am so excited to be able to talk about your work, but also to introduce it to, like I said, maybe teachers who didn't know this series was out. And I will put all of the information to the books below so people can pick them up, both in the e-copies as well as the hard copies if they want. Thank you all so much. This was just wonderful. I'm glad I wore a party dress.
Thank you, Samantha.
Nice to see everybody.
Thanks, Sam.
Yes, very nice
Yeah,
to see you.
stay safe.
Take care.